Hello and welcome, Star People. This is APM, your intrepid star guide, and this is the Outlaw Astrology podcast, where we dismantle astrological dogma and build a practice rooted in critical thinking, lived experience, and radical honesty about how the cosmos actually works in our lives. And so, today's focus is oppositions, the 180-degree traditionally called tense, conflicted, at war with itself. But what if that framing is the actual problem? What if the opposition isn't a tug of war at all? What if it is an invitation to hold two truths at once? So, last episode we reframed squares as creative friction rather than punishment, the engine of personal revolution and evolution. Today we're going to go further into the aspects that are called hard aspects and ask an even more uncomfortable question: what if the entire either-or binary we built around oppositions is a myth we inherited, not a truth we discovered? But before that, some housekeeping. This is episode 166 in our arc on friction, tension, and the so-called difficult aspects. And last week we talked about squares. This week we talk about oppositions, and next week we close the arc with examples of squares and oppositions that can build character, grit, and pivotal life change. So, if this topic and what we're laying down here is interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. We definitely appreciate that. Leave a review if this work matters to you, and join us on Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube for Astro Breakdowns. There's also a free and paid newsletter. The free newsletter comes out every new and full moon. So if you're interested in that, all those links will be in the show notes. And so here's what we're going to be stepping into. Have we been treating our charts like a battlefield? Sun opposing Moon, Mars opposing Saturn, Venus opposing Pluto, and wondering why we always feel like we're losing. This episode is for all of us and all of you, because the battlefield may not be real. Alright, onward. So, here's what the topic is. Let's step on into it. What we've been taught about oppositions, and why that's the half the story, because let's just be honest, it actually is half the story. Our charts feel like battlefields. Isn't it curious that tug of war makes us think of war? I mean, literally the word war is right there for everyone to see. So that turns our inner worlds into battlefields, minefields, where we're constantly losing or gaining ground. It's a competition. Someone must win. Someone must lose. That's just how that seems to go. Okay? So the traditional interpretation of an opposition is conflicted, polarized, and it's the aspect of projection and confrontation. So the two planets are sitting directly across the zodiac from one another. So for example, you would have Moon in Cancer, Saturn in Capricorn. Those two are sitting in signs that oppose each other because there is a polarity in astrology, and that would be that polarity. So that tension would be there. And, well, Moon is a mirror. Saturn is about limitations, so you can see they're both duking it out. I say that with quotes. And each is threatening to cancel the other out, because in the traditional interpretation is either the Moon's going to win or Saturn's going to win. But both of them cannot win together, can they? Or, no, they can't. Of course not. But really, could they? Let's think about that. Let's think about that. And so, there is a partial truth to the way traditional astrology, as we understand it, because all these traditions come from traditional astrology. And yes, oppositions do describe a genuine tension. So when two planetary energies are in direct dialogue across the chart, that conversation can feel loud, uncomfortable, and even destabilizing. We're not pretending otherwise here, okay? We think critically. It would be foolish, stupid, unwise to ignore tension when it exists, when it's clearly obvious. We're not suggesting anyone do that. We're not doing it. We're not suggesting you do it. We're not suggesting anyone else do it, okay? But here's a complication. Notice how quickly traditional astrology moves from tension exists to tension is bad. And ask yourself, who benefits from teaching people that their inner conflicts are problems to be managed or fixed rather than intelligences to be integrated? So there's a language problem here. And the words we use matter enormously. So opposition in everyday English means adversarial, confrontational, something to overcome. When astrology borrows the word wholesale, it imports all of that baggage. But in geometry, an opposition is simply 2 points in perfect balance across a shared axis, and that's a very, very, very different thing, okay? So the key point here is that traditional astrology often stops at the conflict and never gets to the integration part. It identifies the polarity, yes, thank you very much, names the tension, also good, thumbs up, and leaves you there, confused, scratching your head going, okay, now what? So this episode is about what happens after you identify that tension. It's about what you do with it. And so there's a myth of the either-or binary, okay? Why? Because oppositions, honestly, they're not zero-sum games, okay? Zero-sum game means you win, I win, you lose, period. You know, there's no we can both win. That's just not how that works. So here's the binary. The classic opposition narrative goes like this. You can only be one thing at a time. Sun opposite moon means your conscious identity and your emotional needs are at war. Mars opposite Venus means desire and love are incompatible. It's one or the other. You have to choose a side. Or do you? Here's an uncomfortable question. Here is an uncomfortable question. Where did this either-or binary thinking come from? Is it the aspect itself telling us we must choose? Or is it a much older cultural inheritance, one that struggles to hold paradox, that needs categories to stay clean, that's deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity, the unknown, and uncertainty? So we have a Western philosophical problem here. Much of traditional astrological thinking is shaped by cultures with deep attachment to dualistic thinking. Good, evil, light, dark, good, bad, mind, body, masculine, feminine. And so oppositions map beautifully onto that worldview, which is precisely why they got interpreted the way they did. Yet there's a cultural lens. That's a cultural lens. It's not a cosmic law. It's not a law at all, really. So how about we do a reframe right here, right now? Try this on for size. An opposition isn't asking you to choose between two planets or points. It's asking you to find the axis. Every opposition has a midpoint. It's like a seesaw. There's always that middle fulcrum that everything balances on. You're being asked to find that middle part, that creative center, that still center between the two poles. And that midpoint is not an empty point. It's an integration point. It's the place where both truths become something larger than what either could be alone. Let me give you a real world example. The sun in Capricorn opposing moon in Cancer. Okay? Traditional astrology says that your ambition, that your emotional needs are in conflict. A more honest reading says that you are someone who understands both the necessity of structure and the necessity of softness and fluidity. And your life's work, if you have this particular aspect, is learning to lead with both, not to choose between them. That's not a problem. That's a profound kind of wisdom. So what you're choosing is both. A third thing that both are part of that create a greater whole. See what I just did there? So the key point here is that either or framing keeps us all small, and the integration framing sets us all free by allowing us to expand. And that expansion is uncomfortable. Consider the butterfly. It goes into its chrysalis as a caterpillar, crawling around, not flying, and dissolves into goop. That experience cannot be comfortable. But then, when it's time to emerge, their sticky, wet wings still on their back, it takes hours and hours and hours of panting and of struggling and of pushing that chrysalis open for the butterfly to emerge and be able to fly away. If the butterfly does not struggle to get out of the chrysalis, its wings will not be strong enough to support its body, and more than likely it will die. I know this because people have tried to help and it did not work out for the butterfly and led to a lot of crying for the person trying to help and maybe the children watching. Avoid, avoid, avoid. The whole point of that exercise is simply to say, we've been handed a much smaller story, and our internal cosmos is much more vast than traditional interpretations of oppositions can allow. And so it's an invitation to think differently here. So oppositions can be also considered a mirror. It is a self-awareness aspect. And so let's talk about mirrors and how oppositions can be one. So here's the thing about oppositions. They actually do mirroring extraordinarily well. They reflect. A planet in opposition has a 180-degree view of the other. There's no hiding. There's no blind spot in the usual sense like a conjunction, for example. The opposition forces you to see what you'd rather not look at directly. And so that creates tension, and that tension creates a question about projections. And so here it is. One of the things I've noticed is that traditional astrology talks a lot about oppositions and projection. We project the energy of the aspected planet onto other people rather than owning it ourselves. And this is real and worth examining honestly. Now, let's push back a bit further. We could just let it sit there and say that, yes, it's about projection and leave it right there. Not particularly interesting to me. So let's push a little bit further. And here we're going to push like this. Projection isn't a character flaw. It's a coping strategy. When we've been told that parts of ourselves are unacceptable, too much, too contradictory, and by the way, everybody has contradictions in themselves that are part of who they are, we externalize it, okay? So, oppositions don't create projection. Cultural suppression of complexity creates projection. The opposition is where the evidence shows up, okay? So, self-awareness can be a gift. Okay, this is why oppositions worked consciously become extraordinary tools for self-knowledge, because the thing you keep finding out there in partners, in enemies, in strangers, in co-workers who irritate you unreasonably is always a signal about what's unintegrated in here. This is not a personal failing. This is not a need to criticize and judge ourselves unfairly. It's merely that we are human beings living human existences, doing the best that we can, and oppositions provide us the opportunity to have more self-intimacy, self-awareness, and therefore more integrated self and wholeness. So self-awareness can be a blessing, but the path to self-awareness is not always pleasant. As a matter of fact, it's not pleasant most of the time. And any story that you can become more whole, more integrated, more self-actualized, more individual or individuated And you can do this from the comfort of your armchair, just while drinking tea and nibbling on bonbons or what have you, or homemade biscuits or what have you, it's nonsense, quite frankly. And if you get lost in the comfort zone, I can learn from the comfort zone by feeling joy all the time and only happy and no other emotions, you're going to find that your life is a lot less alive and a lot less juicy, because you don't have to grow to feel happy. At least, I can feel happy right now. I am nibbling on a blueberry muffin, gluten-free, and sipping on a smoothie, and that should be enough, for me to go, woohoo, life is wonderful, I should stay right here. But I'm not that sort of person, and if you're listening to this and listening to me, then you aren't that sort of person either. Okay, because you could be doing anything with your day, and instead you're listening to me because something about this resonates for you. So the whole point of the exercise here is that none of this is about a punishment. This has nothing to do with personal failures. It's simply to do with being human, period, full stop. And so here's another way that we can also read this, because everything has a shadow. I'm sorry, but it does. Psychology just teaches that yes, we have that which is in light, but what is occluded? Shadow is the things about ourselves that are occluded. Sorry about that. That was my phone making all the noises. Forgive me. Alrighty, so we're going to move on. And so let's talk about shadow work. So Venus opposing Pluto doesn't mean that love is dangerous. Okay? That's not what that means. I know that's one of the interpretations you're going to hear. Okay? It just means that you haven't made peace with your own power, your own hunger, your own capacity for transformation. So the opposition is pointing at the unfinished work, but it's not condemning you for having unfinished work. You're not being condemned because you have Venus opposing Pluto. Okay? That's not what's happening. It's not a personal failing. It's not something you need to fix. It's something you just need to understand, comprehend. And when I say comprehend, I don't mean a exercise in mentality, because comprehension means to grasp, which means you take this knowledge and you look at it in your life as lived experience, and then you understand it on a deeper level, which is also in your body. So in your body, and also in your feelings as well. Okay? So it's just not just a mental exercise with no integration and no way of living out the knowledge, because knowledge that only lives in your head stays in your head, and it never becomes part of you or part of your life. So a key point here is that oppositions are the most self-aware aspect in the chart. When you engage with them honestly, you are less comfortable with trines. Well, that didn't make any sense. Anyway, let me restate that. Wow, I'm having a day. Oppositions are the most self-aware aspect in the chart when you engage with them honestly. So, they're less comfortable than trines, less urgent than squares, and less possibility-oriented than sextiles. Yet they are uniquely able to show you the shape of your interior landscape if you're willing to look. And by the way, oppositions require courage, because they don't always show you the nicest parts of yourself. They show you parts that, for a good reason, you really don't want to look at too closely, because who wants to? It's not comfortable to look at that. It's not comfortable to hold paradox. Paradoxes do not resolve neatly. They are rather like standing on sand. It's always constantly shifting. You never feel like you have certainty. And our human brains and nervous systems are wired to desire certainty over all else, which is why when someone tells you something you've known and they validate your point of view, it feels good, because your nervous system is wired to look for certainty and to avoid uncertainty as much as possible, which is why it makes meaning, because that meaning making is helping your nervous system assess your life and assess experiences and sort them into what this will cost me and how much it will cost me and what will be the consequences and will I still be alive after all of that. So that's the whole point. And so the oppositions can provide us with self-awareness, and that self-awareness could point the arrow toward wholeness. So a question I have, and a question certain other people have been asking, is this: do oppositions mean the same thing in every chart, in every moment of our lives? Okay, so that would suggest, the question suggests that oppositions are fixed. They only have one meaning. It means this all the time, no matter what. And so here's a question you might want to ask yourself. Say, for example, you have a Saturn-Moon opposition in your chart. And ask yourself, does that opposition feel the same at 22 years old as it does now if you are, say, 42? If you are, say, 30 right now? So does it feel the same? Does it feel the same to you? If you have a Mars-Neptune opposition, does that operate the same way in your first relationship as it does in your creative practice today? So if you're a creator and you fell in love when you were 22 years old, that Mars-Neptune aspect is at work, but does it feel the same? Does it operate the same in both circumstances regardless? So, and if the answer is no, and it almost certainly is no, then what does that tell us about fixed aspect interpretations? And so, here's something to consider. Aspects are not static. A natal opposition describes a recurrent theme, a tension you'll return to throughout your life, but the form it takes, the arena it plays out in, the degree of integration you've achieved, these change constantly. So the aspect is the question, not the answer. And here's the thing, context changes everything. A Mercury-Jupiter opposition in the chart of a 19-year-old might show up as intellectual arrogance or scattered thinking, or overinflated thinking. Okay? However, in the chart of a 50-year-old who's done the work, put in the effort to put practices in place and on a daily basis work on this particular aspect, that same opposition might be the thing that makes them more generative, a more wide-ranging thinker in the room. Same aspect, completely different expression. Now, when we consider transits and progressions, oppositions also activate differently depending on what's moving through your chart at any given time. So, a natal Venus-Saturn opposition, for example, that's been quietly workable for years can suddenly feel very, very loud when Saturn returns. So thereabouts, your first Saturn return about the ages of 28 to about 30, or the second return, which happens about around the age of 53, 54, thereabouts. And so those two times, a Saturn returning can make a Venus-Saturn opposition very loud. Or say when a progressed planet, that's a secondary progression, triggers the axis between the two. So let's say it's on the Venus side of things. Aspects are not fixed, they're responsive. So if it ends up on the Venus side of things, the Venus is going to talk pretty loud. This entire apparatus is going to talk loud, except the focus will be an integration between values. What do you value? And what are you willing? What matters enough to put in the hard work? What matters enough to focus? What matters enough to concentrate? What matters enough to filter out all the noise so you can hear the signal? That is Venus-Saturn opposition aspect. So Aspects, when they're in transits and progressions, they are not fixed, they're responsive, they're relational, okay? Which leads me to a deeper question, and it's this. Is any aspect difficult in an absolute sense? So, are we always talking about a particular person at a particular moment with a particular self-awareness in a particular set of life circumstances? And the answer is the latter. Always, always, always. So, in any aspect, when it comes to even oppositions, they're not necessarily difficult in the absolute sense. The absolute meaning that all the time, every single time. What we're talking about here is specific relationship, a specific moment, a specific self-awareness. We're looking at a moment in time, which means that whether or not that aspect is difficult is actually an interpretation. Aspects are open to interpretation, which means it's not a fixed thing that it's difficult. Oppositions are not necessarily difficult. Sometimes you might notice that you're in the middle of a Moon-Venus opposition and find yourself going, wow, this isn't dreadful. I rather like this. Why was everybody talking about oppositions being terrible? Aren't they always terrible? I mean, you'd be thinking that, yes? So, which leads me to the key point that I want to make here, which is meaning is not contained in the aspect itself. It lives in the relationship between the aspect and the person living it, between the aspect, between the two planets. And so this is what makes astrology a practice rather than a prediction. We're not here to predict, we're here to understand. We're here to think critically about our charts. We're here to think differently. Because what's left out of the conversation more often than not is us. Us as active participants. Instead of us being passive, meaning that the chart happens to us, or we happen to have this chart, we are now being invited to be part of that conversation, to actively choose. Okay, I have a Moon-Venus opposition. How have I lived that out? Where have I seen that in my life? Let me get out my ephemeris so I can track that transit, so I can track that solar arc, so I can track that moment in time and that experience to see how I turned up and how it turned up for me. As opposed to saying, well, oppositions are always terrible, and Moon-Venus oppositions, which I have in my chart, is terrible, so I'm fated to have challenges with my feelings and my values, and that I might tend to people please a bit more to try to make people happy rather than being honest about my feelings and feeling sensitive and moody when it feels like people cannot read my minds or read my emotions. And so this aspect could be a people pleasing aspect. It could also be an aspect where we project our feelings and our own moody thinking onto other people, or where we might not be so kind to our emotions by wrapping them up, hiding them behind a wall so that other people will feel happy and comfortable. So, if we're going to be looking at an aspect of Moon-Venus, it is not a thing that most people don't know about astrology, is that your chart gets dinged. Okay, so conversations get louder when planets start transiting, meaning, and the sky always moves, so they're always transiting. So when it's Cancer season and you got yourself a new moon in Cancer, and that means when the sun and moon are conjunct, meaning in the same part of the sky or in the same part of the cosmos, that is called a transit. And what that means is it wakes up that moon part and activates that Moon-Venus opposition. So now it's louder and there can be thereby heard, felt, experienced. So a good experiment is a lunar cycle experiment. If you want to understand your transits and how they affect you and how your lived experience plays a part, you want to track your oppositions. So, for the course of a lunar cycle, we're going to stop theorizing, we're going to start to investigate. And so, over a lunar cycle, we're going to track natal oppositions in real time and let your lived experience challenge the traditional interpretations. So this is how you do it. Identify your natal oppositions. Write them down. So like say, for example, we got a Moon-Venus opposition. You're going to write it down, and for each one, note the planets, the signs, the houses involved. Then, for one lunar cycle, roughly about 28 days, you keep a simple journal. When does this tension arise? If it does, what does it actually feel like in your body? And does it feel like conflict, or does it feel like something else? That's it. And here's a question to ask. Does the either-or binary hold up in your lived experience? Or does it consistently ask you to hold two truths at once? So, here's what to pay attention to. Notice when you project, when you find the aspected planet out there in someone else rather than being able to see it in yourself. Notice what triggers that. Notice what it costs you to keep the projection going. Notice what becomes available when you bring it back into you. No one is saying you need to label it bad. This requires you to be open and curious rather than judgmental and critical of yourself. So this is not a personal failing. Just because you saw something out there, that's what people do. It's a survival mechanism. It's self-protective. It's not meant to destroy you. It's not meant to harm you, anything like that. It's just something you need to be aware of. That's it. So be as open and curious as you can. If you find yourself feeling tender, this is not the time to do that practice. This requires you to be able to sit with discomfort, and if you're feeling very sensitive, I would leave this practice for a time when there's less emotional reactivity, moodiness, and sensitivity. It's too high stakes to fight against that. I don't want you to fight your feelings. It needs to be for a time when things are more cool, more placid, and you can do this and hold discomfort with curiosity. Okay, so you're also going to want to notice, does the opposition feel the same way every day, every week, every mood? Or does it shift? Does it feel like punishment when you're depleted? Or like a superpower when you're resourced? Track that as well. Because that variability is data, and that matters, okay? And the purpose of this whole experiment is we're not trying to prove traditional astrology wrong. We are trying to build an evidence base from our own lives. That evidence will mean more to us than anything in astrology can ever tell us, including this one. That would be me, APM, your intrepid star guide. So, whatever I tell you about your chart, doesn't matter who says it. It doesn't matter if the most famous astrologer in the world says it. What matters most is what you see in your chart, what your inner world tells you about it, not what I say or what anyone else says, okay? And we are rolling up to the end, star people, as usual. Thank you very much for being here. And here's the key takeaway. Oppositions are not a war between two parts of yourself. They are the aspect of integration of self-awareness, okay? So you're being asked to hold paradox with enough skill and courage that something new becomes possible. The either-or binary was never the point. The point was always the and part. So it's a both-and experience, not an either-or experience. And here's your journal prompt. Choose one natal opposition and write it a letter, not to one planet, to both. So ask them, what do each of you need from me? Where have I been making you choose sides? Where have I chosen sides? What am I projecting? What would it look like if I stopped choosing and started integrating? Okay? So sit with whatever comes up without trying to resolve it immediately. Integration is, well, it's really fast. Star people is really fast. The next episode coming up, episode 167, when hard aspects are actually blessings. So we're going to do some examples of squares and oppositions that build character, grit, and pivotal life changes. So because sometimes the aspect that nearly breaks you is the one that makes you who you are. And with that being said, I'm APM, your intrepid star guide, and this is the Outlaw Astrology Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and before we go, some quick housekeeping. You can find us on Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. Links in the show notes. There is the Daily Stargazer podcast and newsletter, free and paid versions. The free version comes out every new and full moon. And please like, subscribe, and share so that others can find our wonderful, wonderful wisdom. And thank you very much for listening. And with that, stay curious. Stay critical, stay honest about what you actually experience. Your chart is not a verdict, it is a conversation, and you get to talk back. Peace and astro magic, star people.